Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever worried about your health or the health of your kids and how to make it better, then do we have the Sicker, Fatter, Poorer show for you. Today I'll be talking with Dr. Leonardo Trasande, an internationally renowned leader in children's environmental health and the author of a brilliant, albeit a bit unsettling, book on endocrine disruptors and health, Sicker, Fatter, Poorer. And that's just what I want to talk with him about today, about the urgent threat of hormone-disrupting chemicals to our health and future, and what we can do about it. That, plus we'll talk about glass containers, plastic number 3, eating organic, the dirty dozen, BPA and BPS, flame retardants and mattresses, Rachel Carlson and Silent Spring, and what in the world Joni Mitchell and paving paradise has to do with anything. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Leo. Are you ready to shine?
I'm already shining.
Woohoo! All right, before we dive right into things, Leo, where'd you grow up and how was your health?
So I grew up in the West Village in New York City, moved to the Jersey suburbs when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And went to school up in Boston and got into the world of environmental health in a unique way. I started as thinking I was going to be a pediatrician, was very interested in health policy.
Yep.
So I decided to get a master's public policy from a medical degree, was bitten by, if you will, the bug of capital fever, something like that,
Yep.
and decided to spend a year after my residency working for then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton, which was a transformative experience, not just because of the exposure to policy and its impact on kids, but because I learned all about environment and its impact on health and how much we could do. And that really set me on the trajectory that I'm here talking to you today.
It's interesting. I don't even know. I can't really call it met. I rode in a little car underneath the hill with Hillary one time, and
Nice.
and got to eat with the senators and stuff. And I was aghast at how little health there was, so to speak, on the hill. Which is actually kind of part of the challenge today, is when those who are struggling with their health are in charge of health policy.
Isn't that the truth? There are that lifestyle is intense with travel, the staffers working long hours, not really having time to even just take basic breaks. It speaks to how hard, as much as we give our leaders in Capitol Hill a lot of grief, the reality is they do work extremely hard, just not always in the same direction we all would like to see.
So let's go from there and talk about something powerful you did in 2014. You were asked to organize, and see if I can get this right, the Endocrine Disrupting Chemical Disease Burden Working Group.
It's a mouthful, but at the core, the European Union asked us to put together an estimate of the disease burden that could be due to hormone disrupting chemicals. So just to do some hormones 101, hormones are the basic signaling molecules our body uses to maintain body temperature, maintain metabolism, salt, sugar, sex, the works. And hormone disruptors are synthetic chemicals that scramble those signals and thereby contribute to disease and disability. So we looked at just the chemicals for which the evidence was strongest and found that the costs of these synthetic chemicals on human health in Europe alone was 163 billion euro. That's $209 billion a year. So that's 1.2% of Europe's gross domestic product. Basically, that's an annual cost insofar as exposures continue at current levels. And that is based on fewer than 5% of hormone disrupting chemicals, a subset of diseases due to these hormone disrupting chemicals, and a subset of costs due to diseases due to these chemicals. So it's an underestimate of an underestimate of an underestimate. And yet we're talking about 1.2% of Europe's GDP. So as a dad, this got me thinking, well, what's going on in the US? And in the US, we banned only 11 chemicals from personal care products.
Compared to Europe,
where there's over 1,300 that have been banned. And for flame retardant chemicals, we've had until 2013 a law in California that required
Mhm.
they be sprayed into every piece of furniture in the upholstery. So we literally have a generation of American kids that was exposed to these chemicals that literally disrupt thyroid hormone, which is crucial for a kid's brain development. So as a pediatrician, I was trained to get the baby's newborn blood spot from the heel, and as part of that testing, what we usually do is look at thyroid hormone
Yeah.
because you can treat kids and prevent them from being intellectually disabled. But now we know that prenatal thyroid hormone, even in the clinically normal range, the kind of thing you go to an obstetrician, you draw blood, and the obstetrician says, "You look good, you're fine." But even in that normal range, subtle shifts can increase cognitive dysfunction, even autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we're literally running in a generation that is functionally, for lack of a better term, flame retarded as a result of these chemical exposures. Whereas in Europe, the levels have been much lower because they didn't require these chemicals be added to furniture,
Mhm.
and the levels in a population of Europe are much lower. The average American has a 95th percentile of flame retardant in their blood compared to the average European.
So let's go from there and let's start to look at what these chemicals do, because it's one thing to say, well, I'm in the 95th percentile. So is everybody else. We're doing fine.
Right. So the reality is, we know most of all of late that chemicals literally make us fatter. So the prototype chemical is a chemical called bisphenol A or BPA. It's been in the news a lot lately. It's used in the lining of aluminum cans and thermal paper receipts. It's literally a chemical that makes fat cells bigger, disrupts the function of a protein that protects the heart called adiponectin,
Mhm.
and it's a synthetic estrogen, so it can have a sex specific effect on body mass as development, especially puberty, occurs. So you've got the perfect storm, if you will, for somebody to literally be fatter and sicker. I'm not saying the entirety of diabetes and obesity is due to these synthetic chemicals. Diet and physical activity are clearly the leading factors driving the obesity epidemic in the United States today, and the diabetes epidemic for that matter. But the reality is, synthetic chemicals are a third and important and under-recognized factor driving that epidemic. And in contrast to diet and physical activity, which can be hard to sustain in a healthy way, you can change manufacturing practices in a way that reduces these exposures much more quickly, with results that change in days, if not weeks.
Awesome. So let's go back in time and let's go back and compare a 1962 playground with today.
Well, the reality, and we describe it at the very beginning of the book, is that if you compare the population of kids in 1962 playing in a New York City playground not far from where I grew up in the West Village to 2019, the reality is you'd have many more children who are obese, many more children, a few children with diabetes, whereas type 2 diabetes did not exist in kids at all until literally as I was training as a pediatric resident in 2003. It just popped out of the clear blue sky. We have autism and ADHD. Now, literally 4% of boys in the United States have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. I'm not saying the entirety of that increase is due to environmental factors. There are lots of factors that we have to debate, but it begs the question. There's not something in the human genome that spontaneously changed in 30 years driving that epidemic. We have girls developing in puberty profoundly earlier. It used to be 13 was when you would go through puberty. Now it's 9, 8. That's a new abnormal. I can't call it normal because early puberty is associated with a higher risk of breast cancer. We have a variety of cancers that have increased 30 to 50% in boys. Testicular cancer, the story of Lance Armstrong is great, leaving aside the drugs that were used. I'm not talking about that story. I'm talking about his testicular cancer survivor story.
Yes.
We've gotten really great at treating it, but it's increased 30 to 40% over the past 30 years. Why? Why even have to have this problem in the first place is what we have to ask ourselves. So we've seen fundamental transformations that we've literally, as a population, gotten sicker as a result, in part, of synthetic chemical exposures that have come on the scene around the same time.
So thank you. And some of those are pesticides, flame retardants, plasticizer chemicals, bisphenols, line food and beverage cans. What are a lot of the long-term effects that we're looking at? For instance, this isn't just diabetes. We're talking lower IQs and more.
Right. So the evidence is greatest, as I hinted at, for effects through changes in thyroid function in pregnancy on the developing brains of young kids, producing predictable outcomes like cognitive deficits, autism, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We've already talked about childhood obesity and diabetes, as well as adults. There's a study looking at the Teflon-like chemicals, the perfluoroalkyl acids.
Yeah.
Literally in one study, in women especially, they found that folks who had lost weight through a successful diet and physical activity intervention regained their weight in relationship to the measured levels of perfluoroalkyl substances measured in their serum. So this is not just hypothetical associations in a snapshot. This is real impact in the long term on people's lives. We're talking about male reproductive conditions, infertility, which is increasing so rapidly. We're seeing testicular cancer increase that I already talked about. We're seeing a variety of conditions. Even impotence is in the equation, with 40% of men over the age of 40 having some degree of potency issues, such that you're seeing advertisements on Spotify and various social media trying to get you discreet delivery of medications to take care of the situation. But more seriously, we're talking about life and death matters in some cases. So decreases in testosterone, which have been tied in particular to phthalates, the chemicals that make plastic soft, if you will, have been disrupt testosterone function. And low T is either a marker for or a predictor of cardiovascular disease in adults, as well as stroke. So we're literally talking about a life and death matter, not just a lifestyle matter. Finally, in women and young girls, we've already talked about puberty changes, but we're talking about endometriosis and fibroids, which have been associated in studies with these preventable exposures. Bisphenol A, which we talked about, has been associated with effects on the developing ovary, producing potentially ovarian failure or polycystic ovary syndrome or a host of other conditions that are on the map. I'm not saying the entirety of those conditions is due to these chemicals. Again, and there are gaps in the science, but we have to fundamentally ask ourselves how much we're willing to gamble with our health.
Thank you so much. I want to dive into so much of this. It's interesting you brought up Lance Armstrong. I don't follow almost anything of what happened and what goes on. I was a professional cyclist. I raced in Europe for a few years. I was offered stuff. I didn't do so well. I hadn't taken it. But one of the interesting things in the drug testing in recent years, and the last I read about it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, is they were looking for plastic in people's bloodstreams, which got me thinking how much plastic and therefore BPA and other chemicals, even in a clean lifestyle, we're bringing into ourselves.
And that speaks to this point about lower testosterone that we've already talked about. So these phthalates have been associated in nationally representative samples with decreases in testosterone, especially in adult men and even in adolescents, speaking to the potential for fundamental disruption that can have lifelong consequences.
And you say, this is very powerful, this is very important. The dose does not make the poison. Everything in moderation. Tell us about this.
So Paracelsus is this Swiss scientist from the 1500s who came up with this adage that the dose makes the poison, and something that's carried forward for us scientifically for nearly 500 years. It's this notion, as you said, that everything should be in moderation, that high levels of exposure are the only exposures of greatest concern. Now, we used to, and I trained under that mindset, don't get me wrong. We used to think with diethylstilbestrol, a pharmaceutical that was given to pregnant women, that it was these high level mistake drugs, for lack of a better term, that caused diseases of concerns. We found in pregnant women, their young girls that were born were found to have a cluster of cancer, and it was a terrible tragedy, and those children got treated, and the drug got banned. But we still deal with a legacy, by the way, of grandchildren now who are developing obesity, cardiovascular disease, and other consequences simply because of their grandmothers being exposed to this pharmaceutical.
Going back to what our grandparents did and was exposed to
Yes.
affect us today.
And that's because there are changes in not the genetic code, but in the expression of genes, signals on the gene to signal the machinery in our body to process those genes in a different way that literally gets carried over from generation to generation, despite the lack of an exposure to that drug, to that hormonal disruptor in the children and then the grandchildren. So this is a legacy problem that we're creating. And that speaks to the profundity of the need to acknowledge this issue in the here and the now. What we now know is a host of chemicals, even lead. The effects are greatest at the lowest levels of exposure. I'm not even talking about lead as a hormone disruptor. There's some things that it may be doing to hormones, but that's probably the most tried and true chemical exposure with effects on people's lives that we accept as a given.
Yeah.
But now it's for mercury, for pesticides, for flame retardants. The list goes on and on. The hits keep coming, where these low level effects are occurring. And that's where the biggest effect is starting to happen. And it's violating this notion that the dose makes the poison. And now we know, and this we probably should have known because we know how hormones work in our body. There's this notion that normal hormones in our body, natural hormones in our body, don't work on straight lines. They work on these U-shaped or S-shaped curves. And the reality is stuff can go up and down in various circumstances because there are lots of competing systems and it's complicated. For synthetic chemicals, we're realizing that is also a problem. There's this notion of non-monotonicity, the roller coaster ride of exposure and response, where maybe low-level exposures aren't a problem, but middle-level exposures are a problem, and then the effects go away when you get to very high exposures. And now even the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences acknowledges that we have to think about these unusual exposure response functions unrolling a 500-year-long scientific paradigm, which is one of the challenges, by the way, in addressing this, because there are a lot of scientists out there, good-hearted, that have been trained in this old mantra. And yet, it's not steeped in evidence as we have it right now. We know, I'm not saying it's true for every chemical under the sun, but we learn, science evolves as time goes on, and we're just understanding now and unearthing a new reality. And that needs to be incorporated in our thinking about how we use chemicals on this planet.
Yeah, and it just got me thinking of a compounding effect, or for instance, pharmaceuticals. They're never tested in how's this one work with this other one? What does it do? What are the side effects? So we can have compounding with different chemicals, even in small amounts as well.
For drugs, you could argue have better evidence, but for chemical exposures, it's frighteningly minimal, as you're suggesting. The reality is that we have thousands of chemicals, probably in each of us, despite our best efforts to limit exposures. And these are interacting in various ways that complexify how we interpret data from studies. And that makes it even harder to unravel what's going on beneath this epidemic. But what little we know in carefully designed studies for 4 categories of chemicals, the flame retardants you talked about already, the pesticides, the bisphenols used in aluminum can linings and thermal paper seats, the phthalates, which are also not just used in food packaging, but consumer care products, cosmetics. These are where the science has taken us to a point where we really have the basis for proactive action, not just at an individual level, but also at a broader societal level.
So let's dive into the proactive action. Before we do that, since we have baby on board now again, go number 2 for baby. She's circled, she's back, or at least we believe it's a she. We'll find out. Did I hear you right? I thought it was 1 out of 39 or 37 boys. What are the statistics with autism now?
So the numbers keep changing because the data keep coming in and raising the stakes here. But the latest study published in Pediatrics found specifically in boys that literally we're down to 4%, up to 4% of boys specifically. In girls, it's much lower. It's in the range of 1%. So we're still in the, I can't think of the numbers off the top of my head. It's a 1 in 40 general population rate that we're talking about in autism. And that's a fundamental transformation from 1 in 10,000 or even lower. It's literally that you talk to educators and they say they didn't see this before a generation ago, not kids on the spectrum. And even these are teachers of special education populations. These deficits are profound, they're diverse, and it's getting more complicated because autism is not really one condition. It's a panoply of different deficits in different kids.
Thank you. So let's go from there and let's empower people today. And let's start talking about some proactive action we can take. Where do we start? What is first step?
So the great news is there are a lot of safe and simple steps we can take right now. They don't have to break the bank and they don't have to be super complicated. So let's talk about bisphenols first. Just getting canned food out of our lifestyle is important. And here's why. I appreciate a lot of people see BPA free on the label, but what we're now realizing is a problem of what we call chemical whack-a-mole, where BPA is substituted with BPS or bisphenol S, a chemical that has a similar chemical structure, excuse me. And that structure means similar function. And what we know about BPS is that it's as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. So we've literally taken BPA out and we see BPS not just in food, but in human populations at similar levels. So we swapped one problem for the other. And unfortunately, BPA free doesn't get you out of the woods when it comes to canned food. So my suggestion is not to eat canned food across the board unless you can document that it's not using bisphenols. There's some companies that are using a naturally derived lining called oleoresin. Bisphenols are in there in the first place to prevent corruption. It's not corruption. That's funny. Corrosion. I didn't say collusion. What I'm talking about here, though, is with some respect to the fact that bisphenols replaced lead, mind you. Lead used to be used in these aluminum cans to solder the container out. So that's the history we're talking about here. But the reality is that there's glass now. There are Tetra Paks. There are lots of options for the same food that don't have to shift the price of the material that you're buying, and you can get them in supermarkets without a problem. Also, when you pay for something, don't take that thermal paper receipt if you can. Get an electronic receipt, and that's because that glossy coating on the outside of the thermal paper is bisphenol lined, typically with BPA or BPS, and you absorb that literally onto your skin right into your body, or obviously there's unconscious hand to mouth behavior that passes those bisphenols into the human body.
How easy is it to pick it up? Like if you just touch and put it in your wallet, are you good? Or that just act with a permeable, semi-permeable membrane called skin, you're just drawing it in.
Unfortunately, it's as tough as it is. I mean, the backside in theory should be bisphenol 3. So if you grab it that way, you might be out of the woods. But even if you touch it for a short period of time, you're absorbing a substantial amount. And here's the crazy thought. So all that hand sanitizer that folks are used to using is actually a great, even a better vehicle. Studies have time and again found that if you did that right before, you really absorb the chemical into your body.
So, and that, let alone the plastic container that the hand sanitizer comes in. Maybe you can dive into plastics because this surprised me that the wrapping on things, but go for it.
Sure. So here's the great news. So just looking at the recycling number on a plastic bottle is a great step. 3, 6, and 7 are the ones across the board to avoid. 3 is for phthalates. Phthalates, we've talked about their effects on male sex hormone. They also tend to divert calorie consumption and production in the body into fat and carbohydrates as opposed to muscle. But 3 is for phthalates, 6 is for styrene, which is a known carcinogen, and 7 is for those bisphenols again. Even though there's some natural plant-based plastics that are out there, they're in the 7 bundle. So you can't distinguish easily between whether it has bisphenol or doesn't have bisphenol. Also, there's this notion out there there's microwave safe. The reality, though, is that that's only a gross shape test. That is it warp?
Wow.
Does it melt in the microwave? So, okay, it's great that it doesn't warp or melt beneath your naked eye, but the reality is that at a microscopic level, there's leaching of the plastic chemical concoction into food and ultimately into our bodies. So that's where, even if you've got a plastic container the food came in, just pass it over to a glass container and pop it in the microwave, and you're in good shape in that regard.
So tell me more about then plastic containers. You're making something fresh for your child to take to school with them.
Right. I try to avoid plastic in those uses across the board. I get it. Some school systems won't let you send in glass. By all means, don't put hot materials straight into plastic containers if you're going to go down that road. Now, these days, you're seeing a lot of companies selling tin, aluminum containers, which don't have BPA because they're not meant for long-term storage. Those are only in the aluminum cans that you're meant to, they're to be put away, whether you're setting up for disaster or for just some medium-term storage, if you will. But the reality is that there are these aluminum linings being put in plastic containers that take out the plastic contact in the first place. So there's some intermediate options too. So you don't have to just do glass. So in addition, avoiding machine dishwashing at high temperatures and with harsh chemicals, those plastic containers is a great step. I hand wash my plastic. Also, if it's etched or scratched, it's time to throw it away. That means the protective sealing, I mean, there is effort made to keep these chemicals out of food in the first place, don't get me wrong. But the reality is if it's etched or scratched, it's time to throw it away.
I'm going to ask one. I'm almost going to regret the answer if you have one, which is I love making green smoothies, as much goodness, nutritional goodness as I can stuff into this thing. I use a Vitamix. I'm very loyal to my Vitamix, but it is a plastic container, and I have
Yep.
wondered about this.
If it's a recycling number 1, 2, 4, and 5, and you're not if you're hand washing it, you're in relatively good shape. We've ourselves in our home, whenever possible, use a glass container to do these kinds of smoothies and mixes that you're talking about. But I appreciate there's some companies that seem stuck in their ways under the guise of, well, you don't want to break it. I appreciate that, but we've come a long way in our technology to avoid that in the first place.
Thank you. So we're going to have to look into that. Another one we had to really dive into this fall when we were going for first, we were planning on pregnancy, and I started down this road. Then, of course, we had our miscarriage, but we really had to look hard to find a non-chemical mattress, which we succeeded. We got, and I'll plug them here, and I get no benefit from them or nothing, joybeds.com. We got an organic cotton top with wool inside and non-organic cotton on the inside and the coil springs, and that's it. Tell me about mattresses.
So this is one of the consumer movements that I think is on its way. We've seen major companies get flame retardants out of furniture after California decided finally to end the requirement that flame retardants be added into furniture to prevent fires. Now, look, I respect fires, they kill people. The tobacco wars era was probably the reason we had this in the first place. But the reality is it's been proven that they don't actually slow the spread of fires, let alone save lives. But back on topic, the reality here is that flame retardants get added to mattresses still to this day for reasons that remain a bit ambiguous to me. They're meant with, I suppose, good intentions and that people don't want fires to spread. So the reality here is that they're these you sleep on these mattresses, and in theory the chemical dust can get out from inside. I mean, they're sprayed not on the actual layer, they're sprayed inside the material, if you will, if it's a synthetic fiber that's used. Wool doesn't require that because it's already naturally flame retarding, so you're out of the woods in that regard. So you're great. Now, does that mean throw away your mattress if you have one of those? No, I'm not suggesting that. I am suggesting if you're buying one that's new to consider it, ask a manufacturer whether it's got flame retardant sprayed in it or not, and that starts a conversation. And that's a theme of this book, is that consumer activism is a major part of the change we seek. Of course, we're going to have regulation, but often, and we saw this with BPA free and baby bottles and sippy cups, it's the consumer action that drives the regulation. Consumers insisted, because of attention to this issue and media attention in particular, that manufacturers changed their ways. The manufacturers changed their ways, and they ran to the FDA and insisted on a ban because they'd already gotten it out in the first place. And here we are with BPA free.
Thank you. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about consumer activism in just a little bit. We're going to run through a bunch more of these
Sure.
non-stick pans.
I'm not a fan. The perfluoroalkyl substances are thyroid disruptors. They may affect brain development in kids as a result. And we've already talked about some of the evidence that they mess with metabolism. Prenatal exposure has been associated with obesity as well. So we're in a situation where we have chemicals that are added to make convenience happen. I appreciate that. It's no picnic to scrub off a metal pan, but in our home, that's what we do. You'll use maybe a tougher soap, or you'll use hotter water to scrape it off. But for us, that provides a sense of reassurance that we don't have to absorb this nonstick chemical. Even though most of the major perfluoroalkyl substances of concern have been phased out, the concern is their replacements, even though they have shorter half-lives in the human body, that is, they get in and get out, may be as problematic as the ones that were originally there.
So we're not sure. We have one greenware, I think it's called, ceramic pan, and you're saying we don't know yet. It could be another whack-a-mole going on.
That is a potential concern. Now, cast iron's a good option. There are some other options out there. Sometimes for baking, going to glass is not unreasonable. They've made them so that they're thermally proofed for higher temperatures as well.
Thank you. So, can I dive more into things that we don't want to put in our bodies? But before we do that, you talked about the concept of an obesogen. You didn't use that word earlier, but of an obesogen, things changing how our metabolism reacts. Tell us about air pollution and what we can do with it about it.
Well, air pollution is something in the United States we've made a lot of progress on over the years. I mean, just living here in New York City has fundamentally changed over the past few decades as we've shifted to more electric in the vehicles and reduced our particulate matter. So that's great. And the reason why that's important is that particulate matter is a complex mixture. It's a lot like tobacco smoke. It's got a various and sundry carbon-based compounds that themselves are either estrogenic, anti-androgenic, and otherwise do things to inflame the body. And inflammation is a great way to set yourself up for diabetes as well. And so insofar as we continue our efforts to combat climate change and reduce fossil fuel consumption, there are other secondary effects that are good for our health.
Excellent. So, like we've got in this house, well, we've got, because we had forest fires last summer, we've got 3 or 4 HEPA filters around. Those would be helpful, I imagine. And you even talk as so far as when you're cleaning your floor in your kitchen to wet clean it so we don't put the stuff up into the air.
That's right, because these persistent organic pollutants from electronics, furniture, mattresses, and such, they accumulate. So simply also recirculating the air by opening the window allows the outdoor air to exchange with the indoor air and get these chemicals out of the home.
Thank you. Let's talk about pesticides and organic. What can you tell us about this?
Yes. So pesticides are among the chemicals with the strongest evidence. It used to be that they were sprayed to get rid of unwanted creatures and critters, but
Mhm.
mostly these days they're in agriculture. And the reality is that these chemicals also mess with thyroid hormone. And birth cohort study after birth cohort study has found predictable decreases, in cognitive function
Mhm.
and found effects even on magnetic resonance images of the brain, with
Wow.
particular parts of the brain not being as well developed, matching the psychological testing results. So you've got a bit of a tight fit in terms of the shoe fitting for the effect. So, eating organic is a great way to reduce your pesticide exposure. Study after study, low income, high income populations has reduced levels of these pesticides by substituting out organic food. Now, I appreciate organic food as a price margin, but that's changed a lot over the past decade, such that the big box stores are adding organic as part of their regular profile of goods they're offering. And as market share continues to increase, we've
Yeah.
seen double digit percentage gains each year over the past decade. You're going to see the pressure on to narrow those margins such that organic may become the new normal. And yes, there are pesticides in some cases added to organic foods. Those are natural pesticides. It's the synthetic chemically based pesticides that are the ones of greatest concern for effects on the developing brains of kids.
Thank you. So I'm assuming if we can't go, or we go organic when we can, if there is a price point, and that's something we have to consider. There is a dirty dozen, and a website I absolutely love, and if I get it right,
Right.
ewg.org.
That's right. And that website, in particular, focuses on the fruits and vegetables with the highest levels of pesticide residues as documented in the food themselves. The general gist, if you can't remember the Dirty Dozen or don't have access to your app or to the web at that particular moment, leafy greens and vegetables in particular, because you eat that outer layer is where the pesticide is sprayed. And so as a result, you absorb more of that into your body. Whereas an avocado or something where you don't eat that outer layer and maybe throw it away is not as important, if you will. I'm not minimizing it, and there's might be ecological benefits to buying organic regardless. But if the budget is constrained, that's a way to save money and still protect yourself.
Thank you. How do we limit exposure to phthalates?
So we've already talked about avoiding certain plastic packaging with the number three. Let's also talk about avoiding highly processed foods, which appear to carry more of the phthalates. But let's also talk about cosmetics, in particular, and personal care products, fragrances, and lotions on the label have phthalate or fragrance. The problem with fragrance is not phthalate. I can't tell you a fragrance has phthalate, but there's this trade loophole in the law that allows chemical mixtures under so called trade secrets to be added in without any data about the health effects. Now, there's efforts underway to increase the manufacturer transparency to the consumer. But insofar as we still don't have that information, I would err on the side of caution and avoid that. And even in a low income population in California, they were able to successfully reduce phthalate exposures in young girls by just providing some basic information about how to reduce exposure.
Awesome. Um, how much do we look at how a food is wrapped? For instance, if it's in kind of a plasti wrap where the food is touching that plastic.
I'm not as much of a fan, though I appreciate that there may not be an alternative based on what we know, and it may not even be the supermarket's fault. But again, here's where sometimes consumer actions have a funny way of creating the change we seek. So there was a study of the perfluoroalkyl substances. So I'm changing topic for a moment. that of 5 packages, finding these perfluoroalkyl substances in the buffet-style food packaging at 2 major supermarket chains, I won't name them, but these 2 supermarket chains on Instagram were literally shoving their stock aside and substituting out a whole new stock of these containers that didn't have the chemicals in the first place. That speaks to, we talk about the power of consumer, but if a major supermarket chain steps up and insists on something being out, that drives market share and force multiplies what you and I might do at an individual level to reduce exposure to these chemicals of concern.
That jumps ahead, and I have about a half dozen more ways that we can avoid things that I want to cover. But what you're really saying is we can vote and have influence with our dollars.
We have substantial power. We've seen phthalate levels drop 30% over the past decade. Bisphenol levels drop 60 or so percent. We're already seeing some momentum. Sometimes it's not the momentum in the direction we need to take it because of this chemical whack-a-mole problem. But that's where the whole transparency movement comes in. And it starts to change the conversation and the narrative. So if a school board insists on getting chemicals out of cleaning products, that is a big force multiplier. If an employer starts to hear feedback from the employees, well, that smell, that fragrance that's used to basically give a sense of fake smell over a stinky whatever, which, by the way, does nothing. All it does is trick your nose into being distracted into something else. That doesn't clean up the stink in a particular location, by the way. But that's the kind of force multiplication that could happen profoundly. And remember, we spend so many hours in our workplaces, in our schools, in our buses, our subways. So we can do a lot at home, but that doesn't take the entire equation of exposure into account.
Thank you. You're making me think of when we were shopping for mattresses, different mattresses that were actually foam-based mattresses, so lots of chemicals that were infused with different natural smells that are supposed to make things better. So not to get tricked. In fact, let's talk real briefly, old furniture. What do we do if it's got exposed foam, and is that a big deal?
Cover it or throw it out.
Excellent. All right. Vacuuming. What do we want to do?
I have no problem with vacuuming. It gets rid of the dust, but mopping avoids recirculating these chemical exposures. So wet mopping is a good first step to get rid of all that chemical dust that's accumulated. And it, by the way, makes it easier to clean up other things, other grime and dirt. So there might even be microbiological benefits as well.
How about things that we should eat, like iodine or seaweed?
So seaweed, strawberries are a great way to increase your iodine diet. You didn't know this, but 2 billion people in the world have iodine deficiency of some level.
Wow.
And that's important because thyroid hormone is part iodine. You don't have enough iodine, you don't have enough thyroid hormone function, period. Many Americans are running around with insufficient iodine intake, and that can counteract the effect of these synthetic chemicals that mess with thyroid hormone in the first place.
Does spirulina have any iodine in it?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I put that in our smoothie, particularly for baby health, and I don't know. I'll have to look into it.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
On that note, we've got baby on board. Anything that we should be thinking about that we haven't covered here?
Toys. So plastic toys. Not a fan of plastic toys. And those electronic devices that we are starting to see get into common mode in babies, remember, they weren't designed with a baby in mind. I see and cringe at this notion that baby starts to mouth an iPhone or some device. Didn't mean to name a particular manufacturer, an Android for that matter. The reality is that those are made with synthetic chemicals and often with flame retardants in mind, because that's where you don't want a device literally sparking and going into flames, right? And it also has heavy metals in the electronics. So that's another reason to add to the equation.
So this is completely off topic, but I was trying to research it beforehand to understand. Since you mentioned iPhones and Androids were rolling out 5G, and I was trying to understand if anybody has looked into this as an endocrine disruptor.
No, and part of the problem here is that the technology is growing so fast. I mean, there was a time not that long ago we were looking at 3G,
Yeah.
right? And so the technology is changing. What little we know about wireless raises concerns, and there are huge gaps in our knowledge of pregnancy and what the effects are on the developing baby. So, as a caution, not based on scientific data, I can't give you much in the way of scientific data, but if you're pregnant and you've got your device, you might want to move that a little bit aside. We're all used to carrying. I could just grab my device, put it right near my head going to bed. That might not be such a terrific idea. You can still hear the device a few feet away when you're waking up to the alarm in the morning.
And we've got my wife now wearing this clothing by a company, I think it's called Belly Armor, which has an EMF protection. And we both of our phones have an EMF shield in it to do the best we can. It'll be interesting in the coming years to see as we go from cell towers
Yep.
on distant buildings or hilltops to almost every single roof, what that does.
That's a great question. It's an opportunity for more research. The tough part about that research is if everyone's exposed, you have no comparison group. And that's one of the toughest parts of science. And that's what pains me in thinking about this.
Yeah, that gets to my thinking, natural versus normal. Now we keep on shifting what the new normal is, and we lose baseline. I used to be we wrote the bestseller Barefoot Running, Barefoot Walking, and one of the fascinating things is if you go walk into one of your offices, if it has a skeleton, an image of a skeleton, human anatomy on the wall, what you'll see is bunions on them. The big toes are pushed in because the cadavers that they used to create it were molded by the person's shoes.
Right.
Not
And
normal, but not natural.
correct. Now that lets me go a little off topic with the word natural. We were
Go
talking
for it.
about this before getting on. So natural is put on a lot of labels these days. I have no idea what it means. It's not scientific. It's not protective. Cage free is also in one of my is in the bad word list when it comes to how I think about it. Really, for foods, organic is really the only differentiating label. GMO free is debated. The benefit of organic is you get rid of the pesticide and you get rid of glyphosate, by the way, and other herbicides that have been controversial in the news, right? Organic cleaning and other materials outside of food, even the word organic is starting to get a bit murky. And that's confusing. So, organic really is about food. And if you focus on organic food, that's really the core message to worry about. But natural, I don't know what it means anymore. And that's sad because there was a time where you could trust natural as not being based in synthetic chemicals.
Since you brought up, thank you so much for sharing about that. And I was joking off air beforehand. If I see natural and I don't see the word organic after it, then I assume somebody went ha ha ha, slapped it right on there.
Right. And the history with organic is that organic chemistry is carbon-based chemistry. So in a way, organic is a bit of what we call misappropriation, a mislabeling, but it's come into practice. It's something the U.S. Department of Agriculture puts a formal seal. There's an organic trade association for food, so we go with it. These are the words we use, but one has to know what the words really mean.
Thank you. Since you said organic and food, and it got me thinking, mattress, cotton. Tell us about organic clothing and what could be happening with the clothing dyes.
Yes. So this is where the science still needs to play catch up. But the organic clothing, the benefit is that you're not using pesticide. You're probably not getting huge benefits from the absorption into skin. Most of the pesticide exposures through diet. But are some specifications that appear to limit some of the more carcinogenic dyes that are used widely in the industry. They don't I'm not suggesting you throw out every piece of clothing that isn't that way, mind you. Most of the effects of these dyes and these materials are really in communities where the dye is applied in the first place. So, what you're doing when you're mostly focusing on that is really having ecological benefit and driving the change that to me is is one of the next frontiers. But again, here's where, if you're a family that's constrained, I at least I think about it as a dad who's distracted constantly.
Yeah.
I need things in 30-second, 1 minute, 2 minute kind of things. That's why I talk about four categories of chemicals. Even the Teflon like chemicals don't come into the most regular discussions that I bring up, because to me, that's the second conversation. Focus on pesticides, bisphenols, phthalates, and flame retardants. And you're off to a great start. That's the low hanging organic fruit, I hope, in the equation.
Very, very good. Let's talk real briefly about driving the change, and we'll talk about four different categories here. First off, leveraging our economic power. So we were talking about shopping earlier. What else can you tell us?
So really, it's about the power of our wallet and pocketbooks and purses. And we've talked already about BPA free. And we are seeing this with the growth in organic purchasing. We're seeing it with those two supermarket chains literally changing out their products because people called attention to it. Manufacturers are listening. We have a lot more power than meets the eye.
I was just thinking, I was going down my Whole Foods supermarket aisle in my head as I was reading this book, and there's some foods that I want to get, mini corn and bamboo shoots and some other things that the can, which obviously try to stay away from can if possible, but they don't even say BPA free. And I'm like, if the FDA hasn't done anything about it right now, which is a whole issue, then I need to call up the manufacturer and say, I'm not buying this until you do
Well,
something about it.
but here's the funny thing about that. If we did that on a small scale, even 5 or 10 phone calls, that would spook the manufacturer in a pretty profound way. I don't think manufacturers are used to getting these phone calls. You look at the documentary Stink, which drove attention to chemicals being added to clothing in particular, but also in cosmetics and fragrances and such. One phone call from one dad really profoundly move the needle in that direction. And that's an uncomfortable conversation. You don't want to be the person receiving that phone call without any training. It's like asking a doctor about something they don't really know. They don't like to say, I don't know.
Yeah. So tell us about laws and labels and what we can do.
Yes. So this is where there have been a lot of state-based movements that have really driven the needle on this issue. So perfluoroalkyl substances have been in the news because of water contamination. Recently, the EPA decided to delay decision making again about setting a safety standard for water. 13 states are stepping right up and saying, no, 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 we are going to supersede what EPA does because EPA is not asleep a bit at the wheel. And you're seeing it again and again. In part, the reason we had a revision of the Toxic Substances Control Act is because state-based movements really scared companies into either insisting for a change in the law or having to deal with 50 different sets of rules. Already, they're having difficulty with regulation differences between the US and Europe.
So we get to get involved. We get to push with our phone calls. With otherwise, we want better laws, better labels, more transparency.
That's the big word. We're seeing this already. One of the major manufacturers of lotions and cosmetics literally started to do its own website and QR code for each product it sells. So that's the kind of transparency that gets us somewhere. They were willing to actually document what their ingredients were.
Beautiful. You mentioned something earlier. You mentioned a key word, W word, water. And so I can't believe I'm going to go there, but since I live in Colorado, right by Garfield County, fracking and hormones.
Fracking is a huge issue because there are about 750 chemicals that are added in the fracking material that literally is used to pump oil out of the ground. And what little we know, unfortunately, in Garfield and other places, is that there are clusters of prematurity, potentially miscarriages and other consequences that can be traced to proximity to these wells. And that's because the chemicals in the fracking fluid literally can get into the water supply and into people's bodies, and they can disrupt hormones in various ways. It's the classic mishmash chemical mixture of that we can't even put a finger on what exactly each of those chemicals is doing just yet.
Thank you. What's it mean to change the healthcare mindset?
So we need healthcare providers to talk about these issues. They're not trained to talk about these issues. On average, I can't remember, but it was probably between 1 and 3 hours of training I got in environmental health in medical school alone, a little bit more in residency. If we start to have the conversation with healthcare providers, that will create awkward moments in conversations that will require additional reading and reflection and ultimately trickle down to the medical profession training such that we'll start seeing medical school curricula take this up. We'll see continuing medical education take this on. That's the change that we seek.
Awesome. What one homework assignment would you give people today, and in particular for parents for their kids?
Go into your into your grocery shelf, pantry, whatever you've got at home and near your kitchen, and look at what plastic you've got in there and ask yourself how much of it you really need. I actually saw someone on social media respond to the book and literally transform their kitchen pantry such that they not only got rid of most of their plastic, if not all, they literally saved 2/3 of their space in the
Cool.
process and were able to stock that much more.
Awesome, awesome. Where can people go to find your book and to find out more and review?
Thank you. So it's leotrasande.com. That's Trasande, or sickerfatterpoorer.com. I will add a shameless plug that reviews go a long way to get the word out of this book. Also, just having a conversation after you read the book with someone else who doesn't know something will take someone from knowing nothing to knowing something. And that will plant the seed for further thought and future conversations.
Awesome. Can you repeat the URL one more time for people?
Leo Trasande, that's Trasande.com, or sickerfatterpoorer.com.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. And if you didn't catch the URLs, come on over to Inspire Nation Show and we'll get you over to Leo as well. Has there been one recent change that you've made recently that you surprised yourself or was like, wow, I get to do X, Y, or Z?
Um, I've seen that thinking more about iodine has actually helped me have more energy and pep. You know, thyroid hormone is something that affects us all across the life course. That's the thing about this book that's really important. We think of this as a mom and baby issue, but this is affecting us as guys, whether we want to have a baby or not. This is affecting women who aren't even thinking of having a baby or past that phase of life. It's affecting everyone. And that's the profound leap that we have to take. I mean, you noticed I mentioned potency and impotency. It's not something that guys like to talk about, but we do need to talk about it. And part of the problem here is what we're exposed to in our daily lives that is inhibiting that.
So, and I'm thinking of when I was living on the East Coast a few years ago, it seemed like you turned around and at least one out of two people, this is completely non-statistical evidence, had hypothyroidism.
And hypothyroidism has a lot of consequences for mood, for energy, for productivity, for cognitive function. Thyroid hormone is a secret weapon in our body. We need to take care of it.
Thank you. Any last words of wisdom you want to share with people today, Leo?
I have a lot of hope and optimism. People talk to me all the time saying, how do you keep an optimistic perspective amidst all these studies and chemicals and concerns? The reality is we've seen so much progress. We've seen drop-offs in disease and disability due to some of these chemical exposures already. We're not there yet. We may be swapping out some problems for others, but we're starting to move the needle in the right direction, having more transparency and dialogue and ultimately rules and regulations that are changed.
Awesome. How quickly can people, if they're making changes in their life, how quickly can it affect our health?
Can be in days. You'll start to see changes in levels in the body. You'll start maybe even seeing less symptoms of nasal congestion and such. You'll see hormone changes in weeks, if not months. And then you'll see decreases in chronic diseases that follow. And you may not see that effect at an individual level, but across the population, you see that.
Woohoo! Thank you so much, Leo. I can't thank you enough. I'm gonna hold and coddle your book here because I think everybody needs to read this. Thank you so much for the beautiful work that you're doing.
My pleasure. It's great being here and great talking with you.
Great talking with you as well. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get sicker, fatter, poorer, and begin increasing your health today and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you so much, Leo.
My pleasure. This was great.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!